Since The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins was published close to half a century ago, it has sold over 1 million copies and been translated into more than 25 languages. Among Amazon's biology and life science bestsellers, it still holds second place. According to Wikipedia, just 7 years ago, voters in a poll acclaimed it the most influential science book of all time. It has become today's official account of how we evolved. For most of us, it is our origin story. What kind of a thing are we? We're the kind of thing you have to expect from how evolution works. Let's discover what that is. What, as a result, we are. I wrote my review a couple of years ago. Here it is. Just a few weeks before undertaking a review of Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, I adopted the skeptical stance of refusing to believe anything I needed math to understand. But Dawkins and his primary sources, his bad boys, George Williams, W.D. Hamilton, John Maynard Smith, and Robert Trivers, all follow in the tradition of the wizard statistician Ronald Fisher. Here's Dawkins of any idea involving evolution. So long as it is formulated only in words, we cannot be sure whether it will work or not. We get a better idea of how feasible such a theory is when it is rephrased in terms of a mathematical model. That's what I want to check up on in this review, but since I cannot critique the math, nor accept uncritically what it's supposed to mean, I can only critique the assumptions expressed in Dawkins' words that the math incorporates. The overarching assumption that the bad boys inherited from Darwin is that evolution requires there to be competition for scarce resources. Whatever makes the victors victorious will get represented in the gene pool as often and for as long as possible. Here's how Dawkins and his bad boys elaborate on that assumption. The critical question is which level in the hierarchy of life will turn out to be the inevitably selfish level at which natural selection operates. To answer this question, we begin by identifying the properties that a successful unit of natural selection must have. In terms of the last chapter, these are longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity. What I have done is to define a gene as a unit which to a high degree approaches the ideal of indivisible particulateness. Define the gene in such a way that I cannot help being right. That's the assumption Dawkins' bad boys express in mathematical form. Dawkins' contribution was to inform us that the process of evolution has been subject to a penetrating analysis and given more elegant form and tell us what the math implied. Turns out, not surprisingly, the implications Dawkins drew out of the math are pretty much the same as the assumptions that went in. What natural selection works on is not individual living creatures, but their genes. So it is genes that evolve, and they evolve to favor their own representation in the gene pool, not ours. So when there's a clash between their interests and ours, the genes have evolved to put themselves first. That's the central principle. I'm going to read it again. What natural selection works on is not individual living creatures, but their genes. So it is genes that evolve, and they evolve to favor their own representation in the gene pool, not ours. So when there's a clash between their interests and ours, the genes have evolved to put themselves first. And he gives an example. How do you find this example? How persuasive? If my home is threatened, I may sacrifice myself to save my family, but this won't be selfless altruism on my part. It will be my genes demanding I sacrifice myself to save my genes' greater representation in all the rest of my family members. And here he goes on. Individuals in our Darwinian world are assumed to be making an as-if calculation of what would be best for their genes. The minimum requirement for a suicidal altruistic gene to be successful is that it should save more than 2 siblings, or children or parents, or more than 4 half-siblings, or uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, grandparents, grandchildren, or more than 8 first cousins, etc. Such a gene, on average, tends to live on in the bodies of enough individuals saved by the altruist to compensate for the death of the altruist itself. So this is Dawkins' reinterpretation of Darwin's theory. Survival lies less in an individual's decisions and more in his or her genes' ability to make as-if calculations. Now, Dawkins comes up with 2 terms to help us appreciate our role in our species' evolution. This new insight is summed up in 2 new terms, replicators and vehicles. Replicator stands for whatever it is natural selection works on to drive evolution. Vehicles are what house the replicators. A body, then, is not a replicator, it is a vehicle. I must emphasize this, since the point has been misunderstood. Vehicles don't replicate themselves, they work to propagate their replicators. Vehicles are whatever the replicators reside in, us, for example. In a single generation, what natural selection selects for is the more successful individuals, but over vast numbers of generations, it is the replicators within us that account for our success, that natural selection picks out and judges for success in replicating. The replicators in living creatures will be various forms of a gene, alleles. They may be clusters of genes that work together, or even parts of genes. They are whatever it is that natural selection can most clearly distinguish as a successful competitor in comparison with other potential replicators. Good genes are blindly selected as those that survive in the gene pool. This is not a theory. It is not even an observation. It is a tautology. Does Dawkins make a value judgment between replicators and vehicles? When you are actually challenged to think of pre-Darwinian answers to the question, what is man? Is there a meaning to life? What are you for? Can you, as a matter of fact, think of any that are not now worthless except for their considerable historic interest? There is such a thing as being just plain wrong, and that is what, before 1859, all answers to those questions were. It requires a deliberate mental effort to turn biology the right way up again and remind ourselves that the replicators come first in importance as well as in history. Their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. If what needs critiquing is not the math, but the assumption behind them, going back to Darwin himself, where can we find a source of alternative assumptions to compare it to? I find that source in an alternative fount of wisdom, ancient Stoicism. Stoics believed in an element, conscious, intelligent, creative, and volitional, that pervaded and maintained the natural order. Let's restrict this element to everything with genomes in it. Even consider genomes as serving as brains to support this intelligence. In a Stoic theory of evolution, it would be this intelligence that created all living creatures, including us. It would be from this intelligence that we get our mental powers, though powers on a smaller scale. We are, as that intelligence is, a person. Our relation to it is not as its atoms, but as persons related to it, as microcosm to macrocosm. According to this updating of Stoicism, evolution has nothing to do with us competing to pass on our genes. Natural selection will figure only as a tool this element might or might not choose to employ. The point of existence is, at a first approximation, existence itself. There just is a natural world of species, groups, individual genes, all playing their parts, whatever those parts are, in the natural order, without distinction between replicators and vehicles. In that world, Dawkins' bad boys assumption won't apply. Who is right? Dawkins is confident. What I am always trying to get over is something about the fundamental properties that must lie at the heart of any good thing in the origin of life on any planet, notably the idea of self-replicating genetic entities. No sane person thinks DNA molecules have conscious personalities, and no sensible reader would impute such a delusion to an author. Oh well. Does the strength of his convictions give Dawkins' interpretation priority over 8 centuries of quite sane Stoic wisdom? That depends on where Dawkins gets his wisdom from. It turns out to come from that other great tradition of wisdom in the ancient world, Epicureanism, or, as we are more familiar with it, atomism. Revived and given mathematical form, it became the primary form of explanation in the scientific revolution 4 centuries ago. It consists of accounting for anything complex or mysterious in terms of simple atoms, each with a few properties you could give numerical values to, that stand in for what the complex thing consists of. Then you come up with math explaining the complex thing in terms of your simple atoms. It didn't matter if your atoms were real. Just being able to model something in mathematical form meant you understood it. Newton explained the colors of a rainbow by supposing light to consist of particles, different weight particles being refracted at different angles. Not true. But now you feel you understand the rainbow. So imagining things as consisting of atoms helped you understand them. Darwin got his atomic theory from Thomas Malthus. Malthus explained why charity was pointless by defining individual city residents as atoms, each taking up so much space and needing so much food. Extra food could be obtained only at the city's boundary, while space needed for extra residents and the demand they made on the food supply increased in proportion to the boundary squared. So cities were always straining against this limit to growth. Saving one person meant someone else had to die. Darwin adopted this atomic model and turned it into natural selection, since in every generation more creatures of a species were born than its environment could support. Only the most fit would survive, passing their values for the species' characteristics on to future generations. Now, everyone could understand how evolution worked. From that point on, progress in evolutionary theory consisted of breaking how creatures varied into smaller and smaller atoms, rather as physicists have done in theorizing about fundamental particles. For Darwin, what got selected was variation. Ronald Fisher broke variation down into how individual genes varied, atoms of mutation. Then Dawkins' bad boys broke down what mutated into just those fragments of genes that survived in our chromosomes over evolutionary time. The gene's-eye view of Darwinism is implicit in the writings of R.A. Fisher and the other great pioneers of neo-Darwinism in the early 30s, but was made explicit by W.D. Hamilton and G.C. Williams in the 60s. For me, their insight had a visionary quality. Meanwhile, the theory had been extended, notably by John Maynard Smith and Robert Trivers. I now see it was one of those mysterious periods in which new ideas are hovering in the air. I wrote The Selfish Gene in something resembling a fever of excitement. For those enchanted by the dance of atoms, the selfish gene has the power of revelation. Dawkins' account must be true, because his bad boys have accounted for evolution in terms of even smaller atoms, each with even fewer characteristics and variants or alleles. What do you choose? Do you choose to think of yourself as a person or as a hierarchy of atoms within atoms? Maybe this will help you. Here's a sample of how we appear to our genes. A decision to bear a new child is usually followed by a decision to care for it. It is because bearing and caring so often go together in practice that people have muddled the two things up. But from the point of view of the selfish gene, there is, as we have seen, no distinction in principle between caring for a baby brother and caring for a baby son. The truth is, we don't have a referee qualified to decide this contest for us. Our science is still dominated by the atomic model. But Stoicism underwent development from the time of Aristotle well into the Christian era, for just as long as the atomic philosophy, far longer than modern science has existed. We don't have any authority sufficiently qualified to declare either invalid. So maybe we simply have to choose from what Dawkins says in his book. To help us make that choice, some quotes. The argument of this book is that we and all other animals are machines created by our genes. We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. The human importance of this subject is obvious. It touches every aspect of our social lives, our loving and hating, fighting and cooperating, giving and stealing, our greed and our generosity. Natural selection has built into us, and it is natural selection we must understand if we are to comprehend our own identities. If you look at the way natural selection works, it seems to follow that anything that has evolved by natural selection should be selfish. Therefore, we must expect that when we go and look at the behavior of baboons, humans, and all other living creatures, we shall find it to be selfish. I think nature, red in tooth and claw, sums up our modern understanding of natural selection admirably. My own feeling is that a human society based simply on the gene's law of universal, ruthless selfishness would be a very nasty society in which to live. But, unfortunately, however much we may deplore something, that does not stop it being true. My purpose is to examine the biology of selfishness and altruism. Much as we might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and welfare of the species as a whole are concepts that simply do not make evolutionary sense. To a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. It is something that gets in the way or something that can be exploited. The logical policy for a survival machine like us might therefore seem to be to murder its rivals and then, preferably, to eat them. Dawkins does concede that we can challenge our genes. Throughout this book, I have emphasized that we must not think of genes as conscious, purposeful agents. Blind natural selection, however, makes them behave rather as if they were purposeful, and it has been convenient as a shorthand to refer to genes in the language of purpose. But we have the power to turn against our creators. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. Now, he says we have the power to turn against our creators, but nowhere in his book does he say how we can tap into such powers or where they can be found, if not in our genes. Without that, I found his reassurances unconvincing. And I don't think he believes it himself. What it all comes down to is, for brevity, we shall again use the convention of thinking of the individual as though it had a conscious purpose. As before, we shall hold in the back of our mind that this is just a figure of speech. A body is really a machine, blindly programmed by its selfish genes. Now recall, this, with all its explicit fatalism, is the dominant account of human nature current today. This is what is taught in school, what we are each assumed to believe about ourselves. Are you happy about that?